October 17, 1943, Portland Harbor, Maine. The frigid Atlantic wind cut through the threadbare uniforms of 893 German prisoners of war as they stumbled down the gangplank of the transport vessel SS Atlantic Ranger. Underofficer Karl Brenner pressed his cracked lips together, tasting salt spray mixed with 3 weeks of thirst aboard a ship where water rations barely kept men conscious. His vision blurred from malnutrition as he watched American guards assemble on the weathered dock, their faces ruddy from cold and what Brenner assumed was the hollow-cheeked hunger that Nazi newspapers had promised to find America's Great Depression casualties. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The North Atlantic crossing had been brutal beyond imagination. Below deck in converted cargo spaces, Brenner and his fellow prisoners had survived on watery cabbage broth and bread so hard it required soaking in rust-tainted water before consumption. His stomach had forgotten the sensation of fullness months ago, back when the Afrika Korps still had supply lines and German field kitchens could produce something resembling actual meals. Now, captured after the collapse at Cape Bon, his body had adapted to constant hunger, the gnawing emptiness becoming as familiar as breathing. He expected Maine's prison camps to continue this slow starvation, perhaps accelerated as revenge for U-boat attacks on Allied shipping. Brenner's hands trembled as he clutched his battered tin cup, the only possession that had survived his capture in Tunisia. Around him, fellow prisoners whispered in hoarse German dialects about what awaited them in America. Gefreiter Otto Lindemann, a farmer's son from Saxony, muttered prayers under his breath while staring at the rocky Maine coastline. Feldwebel Victor Hohmann, who had served with Brenner since the initial North African campaigns, kept his eyes fixed on the American soldiers, searching their faces for signs of the cruelty that propaganda minister Goebbels had assured them defined the American character. The propaganda had been relentless and specific. America was a broken nation, they had been taught, where Jewish financiers hoarded food while honest workers starved in breadlines that stretched for miles. German intelligence briefings showed photographs of soup kitchens and unemployment offices, proof that American capitalism had failed its people so completely that the nation could barely sustain military operations. The soldiers guarding them would be hollow-eyed and resentful, angry at being forced to share their meager rations with enemy prisoners while their own families went hungry. But the Americans Brenner observed seemed disturbingly well-fed. Their uniforms fit properly, unlike the increasingly baggy German issue that hung from Brenner's frame like laundry on a line. The guards moved with energy that suggested regular meals, not the lethargic shuffle of the chronically malnourished. Private First Class Robert Sullivan, a thick-shouldered man with Irish features weathered by Maine winters, approached the formation with a clipboard and what looked disturbingly like sympathy in his eyes. The prisoners were loaded onto military trucks that smelled of diesel and something else Brenner couldn't immediately identify. As the convoy rolled north from Portland toward what the guards called Camp Sebago, Brenner watched the Maine countryside pass through gaps in the canvas covering. What he saw contradicted every lesson about American deprivation. Farms appeared prosperous, with painted barns and livestock that looked healthy rather than the skeletal creatures that now populated German agricultural regions. Small towns featured stores with glass windows intact, not the boarded-up shops that had become common across occupied Europe. Lindemann noticed the same contradictions, his weathered farmer's face creasing with confusion. "In Saxony, my father's herd has been reduced to 4 cows, he whispered. "The government requisitioned everything else. These Americans have cattle in every field, dozens of them, just standing there eating grass like there's no war happening." The trucks climbed into the foothills of western Maine, where autumn foliage blazed in colors that seemed impossibly vivid to men whose recent memories featured only desert browns and ocean grays. Camp Sebago appeared through the trees, a sprawling complex of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fencing that looked more practical than punitive. Guard towers stood at intervals, but Brenner noticed something odd about their construction compared to German facilities he had seen. These towers had enclosed spaces with what appeared to be heating stoves, suggesting American guards would be kept warm through Maine's legendary winters. The prisoners were assembled in the camp's central yard, where October wind carried the sharp scent of pine and something that made Brenner's empty stomach contract painfully. It was the smell of cooking, not the thin odor of boiled vegetables but the rich, complex aroma of seafood being prepared with butter and spices. His knees weakened, and he locked them to avoid collapsing in formation. Beside him, Holman inhaled sharply, his disciplined expression cracking for just a moment. Camp Commandant Lieutenant Colonel James Mackenzie stood before them, a tall man with the weather-beaten features of someone who had spent considerable time at sea. He spoke in English that was then translated by a German-speaking sergeant, but his tone carried something Brenner hadn't expected from an enemy officer addressing defeated prisoners. There was no gloating, no vengeful satisfaction, just matter-of-fact professionalism mixed with something that almost resembled welcome. "You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention," Mackenzie announced through his translator. "You will be treated according to international law, which means you will receive the same rations as American depot troops stationed in this region. Tonight, you will experience your first Maine camp meal. I expect you to conduct yourselves with discipline and remember that we treat you as soldiers who fought bravely, not as criminals." The translation sparked confused murmurs through the German ranks. Same rations as American troops seemed like obvious propaganda, a false promise designed to mock them before revealing the true deprivation ahead. Brenner had learned not to trust enemy promises during his months of combat and retreat across North Africa. Words meant nothing compared to the evidence of empty plates and shrinking waistlines. But then American mess staff began emerging from a large building that the translator identified as the dining facility. They carried steaming metal containers that released clouds of aromatic steam into the cold October air. The smell intensified beyond anything Brenner had experienced since leaving Germany, and his carefully maintained composure began crumbling. His mouth filled with saliva, an almost painful response to the prospect of actual food after weeks of near-starvation rations. The prisoners were directed toward the mess hall in organized groups. Brenner's section filed through the entrance into a space that contradicted every assumption about prisoner treatment. Long wooden tables stretched in neat rows, each set with metal trays divided into sections, actual forks and knives rather than the crude spoons that had become standard in German facilities, and cloth napkins that seemed absurdly civilized given their status as enemy combatants. American mess sergeants stood behind serving stations, and as Brenner approached with his dented tin cup held out in habit, a sergeant waved him toward the metal trays instead. "Put that away, soldier," the translator conveyed. "You'll need both hands for what we're serving tonight." The first serving station featured something Brenner had never seen before, split bread rolls that had been toasted golden brown, filled with chunks of white meat and a creamy dressing, garnished with lettuce that looked impossibly fresh for October. The mess sergeant, a jovial man with forearms thick as fence posts, placed an enormous portion onto Brenner's tray while explaining something in rapid English that the nearby translator struggled to keep up with. "That's a lobster roll, son," the sergeant said through translation. "Maine specialty. Fresh lobster meat caught this morning from Casco Bay, mixed with mayonnaise, celery, and secret seasonings. The bread's from a local bakery, still warm. You boys are getting the same meal the officers ate for lunch." Brenner stared at the sandwich as if it might vanish like a desert mirage. Lobster was something he had read about in books, a luxury food associated with wealthy restaurants in peacetime cities. The concept that this delicacy would be served to prisoners seemed so absurd that he briefly wondered if he had contracted some fever aboard the transport ship and was now hallucinating. The serving line continued with additions that compounded his disbelief. Thick slices of fried potato that Americans called French fries, golden and crisp, still steaming from the fryer. A serving of coleslaw made with fresh cabbage, carrots, and a tangy dressing that contained actual sugar, a commodity that had effectively disappeared from German rations months ago. A slice of pie, real pie made with fruit and butter crust, topped with a dollop of cream that could only come from abundant dairy production. When Brenner reached the beverage station, an American corporal poured coffee into a ceramic mug, real coffee with a rich brown color and aroma that bore no resemblance to the acorn-based ersatz brew that had replaced genuine coffee in Germany. The corporal added fresh cream from a pitcher and gestured toward a bowl of white sugar, indicating Brenner could take as much as he wanted. Lindemann stood frozen at the end of the serving line, his tray loaded with food that represented more calories than he had consumed in the previous week aboard ship. Tears ran down his weathered face, cutting clean lines through accumulated grime and salt residue. "This cannot be real," he whispered in German, his voice breaking. "They are mocking us, showing us food before taking it away." But the American guards made no move to confiscate the meals. Instead, they directed prisoners toward tables and stood back, watching with expressions that mixed satisfaction with something approaching pride. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Private Sullivan approached Brenner's table as the Germans sat in stunned silence, staring at their trays. "Go ahead, eat up," Sullivan said through the translator. "There's more if you want seconds. We've got 300 pounds of lobster meat in the kitchen, enough to feed all of you twice over. This is Maine, boys. We don't run short on seafood." Brenner lifted the lobster roll with trembling hands. The bread felt soft against his calloused fingers, still warm from toasting. He took a small bite, expecting the dream to shatter, but instead experienced flavors that overwhelmed his degraded senses. The lobster meat was tender and sweet, nothing like the tough protein sources that had sustained him during desert campaigns. The mayonnaise provided richness his body had been craving for months. The bread dissolved on his tongue like something from childhood memories of his mother's kitchen in Stuttgart. He ate slowly at first, then with increasing desperation as his body realized this was real sustenance, not another false promise. Around him, 892 other German prisoners experienced the same revelation, their Nazi indoctrination encountering its first undeniable contradiction. America was supposed to be starving, broken by economic collapse and Jewish manipulation. Yet here in this Maine prison camp, enemy soldiers were being fed luxury foods that German officers could no longer obtain through official channels. Holman finished his lobster roll and stared at his empty tray with an expression of profound confusion. His Prussian military bearing had always emphasized discipline and skepticism toward enemy claims, but physical evidence was difficult to rationalize away. He caught Brenner's eye across the table and spoke quietly in German, careful to keep his voice low enough that the American guards wouldn't hear. "Karl, my family in Hamburg has been eating rutabaga soup for breakfast, lunch, and dinner since last winter. My wife's letters describe children begging for potato peels. I just ate seafood that would cost a month's wages in Berlin's finest restaurant before the war. Explain this to me, because I cannot reconcile what we were taught with what I'm tasting." Brenner had no explanation. His training as an Unteroffizier had emphasized following orders and trusting leadership's strategic vision. That vision had assured him that Germany fought from a position of strength while America crumbled under the weight of its corrupt systems. But systems that could feed enemy prisoners lobster rolls in October seemed to possess resources that Nazi planners had either overlooked or deliberately concealed from their soldiers. The meal concluded with American guards encouraging prisoners to take additional portions if they remained hungry. Many did, returning to serving lines with the hesitant movements of men who still expected punishment for requesting more food. Instead, mess sergeants loaded their trays with second helpings, sometimes adding extra dessert portions with the casual generosity of people who had never experienced genuine scarcity. As prisoners filed out of the mess hall toward their assigned barracks, Brenner noticed American soldiers scraping leftover food into waste containers. The quantity of discarded food seemed obscene to men who had learned to treasure every crumb. Half-eaten lobster rolls, untouched portions of coleslaw, barely tasted pieces of pie, all thrown away as if food held no more value than dirt. The casual waste suggested abundance so extreme that spoilage in excess posed no concern. That night, sleeping on clean mattresses in heated barracks, Brenner lay awake listening to the sounds of men whose bodies were processing real nutrition for the first time in months. Some prisoners suffered digestive distress from the sudden influx of rich food after prolonged deprivation. Others simply wept quietly, overwhelmed by the contradiction between expectation and reality. Lindemann's bunk was near Brenner's, and the farmer spoke into the darkness with the confusion of someone whose worldview was beginning to fracture. "In Saxony, we celebrate when we find a chicken egg. These Americans throw away enough food to feed my entire village for a week. How can this be the starving nation we were told about? How can people with such abundance need to steal from others? The questions had no easy answers, but Brenner sensed they represented the beginning of something more significant than mere curiosity. The lobster roll had been more than a meal. It had been evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about the war, about German superiority, about American weakness, and about which system truly provided for its people. Outside, Maine's stars shone brilliant and cold above the camp. Somewhere across those miles of Atlantic darkness, German families survived on rations that would continue shrinking as Allied bombing disrupted supply chains and military demands consumed remaining resources. Here in this Maine prison camp, their sons and fathers and brothers slept with full bellies, beginning a transformation that would prove more devastating to Nazi ideology than any battlefield defeat. The next morning brought revelations that compounded the previous night's confusion. Brenner woke to the smell of frying bacon, a scent so unexpected that he initially assumed he was still dreaming. But the aroma persisted, joined by the yeasty smell of fresh bread and the rich odor of brewing coffee. He dressed in the clean uniform that had been issued the previous evening, noting how the American-provided clothing actually fit properly compared to the increasingly ragged Wehrmacht issue that hung in his footlocker. The mess hall revealed breakfast operations that seemed designed to challenge every Nazi claim about American deprivation. Serving stations featured scrambled eggs, royale eggs with bright yellow yolks that could only come from well-fed chickens. Thick slices of bacon, properly cured and fried crisp. Toast made from white bread with butter and jam. Fresh fruit, apples and oranges that looked impossible for October in northern climates. And coffee, endless supplies of genuine coffee with cream and sugar freely available. Sergeant William Chen, a Chinese-American soldier from San Francisco whose presence in the American military contradicted Nazi racial theories about American social structure, worked the serving line with practiced efficiency. He loaded Brenner's tray with portions that would have fed a German family for a full day, explaining through the translator that breakfast was the most important meal and prisoners needed proper nutrition to maintain health during their captivity. The calories, Chen explained, were calculated by Army nutritionists to ensure prisoners maintained healthy body weight while performing assigned labor duties. The target was 3,500 calories daily for men engaged in moderate physical work, more for those assigned to heavy labor details. This exceeded what German soldiers received in active combat zones, let alone what civilians survived on in bombed cities. Brenner consumed his breakfast with the same disbelieving wonder that had accompanied dinner. Each bite provided further evidence that America operated food systems incomprehensible to European minds. The eggs were fluffy and seasoned perfectly. The bacon contained actual meat rather than the sawdust extended substitutes that had become standard in German rations. The toast was made from flour so refined that it produced bread white as snow, not the gray mixture of grain and filler that German bakers now produced from official allotments. After breakfast, prisoners were assigned to work details that would occupy their days according to Geneva Convention guidelines about prisoner labor. Brenner's group was designated for forestry work, cutting timber in the extensive woods surrounding Camp Sebago under the supervision of American guards and civilian contractors. The work would be physically demanding, but Lieutenant Colonel Mackenzie had emphasized that prisoners would receive appropriate tools, safety equipment, and additional rations to compensate for increased caloric expenditure. The truck ride to the work site provided Brenner's first extended view of rural Maine beyond the immediate camp vicinity. What he observed continued to challenge Nazi narratives about American collapse. Farms appeared prosperous, with well-maintained equipment and livestock that looked remarkably healthy. Small towns featured active commerce, with shops displaying goods and windows and citizens who moved with the purposeful energy of people with sufficient food and economic security. Holman, riding in the same truck, made observations that reflected his professional military training. "Look at their infrastructure," he said quietly to Brenner. "The roads are paved and maintained. The bridges are solid. The electrical lines reach even these rural areas. This is not a failing nation struggling under Jewish financial manipulation. This is an industrial system operating at full capacity." The forestry work site reinforced these impressions. American supervisors provided quality tools, sharp saws and sturdy axes that bore no resemblance to the increasingly degraded equipment that German workers now made do with as metallurgical resources were diverted to weapons production. Safety protocols exceeded anything Brenner had experienced in German military service, with supervisors emphasizing proper techniques and rest breaks rather than simply demanding maximum output regardless of human cost. The midday meal arrived by truck at noon, and its contents provided another assault on Nazi propaganda. The Americans had prepared what they called box lunches, individual meals packed in waxed paper containers. Each prisoner received sandwiches made with multiple meats, cheese, lettuce, and condiments. Fresh fruit. Cookies baked with real butter and sugar. A thermos of soup, cream-based chowder thick with potatoes and what the translator identified as clams, another seafood that Brenner had only encountered in literature. Lindemann examined his clam chowder with the analytical attention of a farmer evaluating crop quality. "This soup contains more cream than my family has seen in 2 years," he said. "The potatoes are large and fresh. The seafood is abundant. Karl, we are eating like nobility while our families subsist as peasants. How is this justice?" The question reflected growing tensions within the prisoner community as the cognitive dissonance between Nazi teachings and lived experience became impossible to ignore. Some prisoners clung to ideology, insisting that the abundant food was temporary propaganda designed to weaken their resistance before true deprivation began. Others, like Lindemann, had begun questioning whether their leaders had told them the truth about anything. Evening meals continued the pattern of abundance that seemed calculated to overwhelm prisoners with evidence of American agricultural capacity. On the second night, the mess hall served what Americans called a shore dinner, a regional specialty that showcased Maine's seafood wealth. Steamed clams served in their shells with melted butter for dipping. Corn on the cob so sweet that prisoners initially suspected sugar had been added. Boiled potatoes with more butter. Blueberry pie made from berries that grew wild across Maine's forests. The clams represented a particular challenge to German assumptions about food preparation and variety. Most prisoners had never encountered shellfish beyond academic knowledge, and the concept of eating creatures that lived in coastal mud seemed bizarre until they tasted the delicate, briny flavor enhanced by butter that would have been impossibly expensive in Germany. Private Sullivan demonstrated the proper technique for eating steamed clams, dipping the meat in broth then butter, encouraging prisoners to try foods that represented coastal abundance foreign to inland European experience. Gefreiter Martin Schreiber, a factory worker from the Ruhr Valley who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht with minimal training, wrote his first letter home that evening. The Red Cross would eventually deliver it to his family in Essen, though not before censors removed portions deemed too sensitive for civilian morale. What survived the censorship process still revealed profound confusion about his circumstances. "Dear Gerda and the children," Schreiber wrote, "I am a prisoner in America, in a place called Maine where trees grow tall and the ocean provides food beyond imagination. Today the Americans fed me seafood that I cannot properly describe because we have no equivalent in Germany. They give us fresh bread daily, real coffee with cream, and meals larger than anything I ate before the war when I worked full weeks at the factory." The letter continued with careful descriptions that avoided direct criticism of German authorities but nevertheless documented abundance that contradicted official narratives. "I am gaining weight for the first time since conscription. The American guards treat us with correctness and sometimes kindness. We work in forests that seem to extend forever, cutting timber with tools that are sharp and well maintained. At night we sleep in warm barracks and eat dinners that leave us satisfied." Similar letters began flowing from Camp Sebago and other facilities across Maine where German prisoners encountered American abundance expressed through regional specialties. The letters created an underground information network that would gradually erode Nazi propaganda's credibility as thousands of prisoners documented experiences that contradicted everything they had been taught about American weakness and deprivation. The third day brought another revelation that challenged assumptions about American society and resource distribution. A Red Cross representative arrived at Camp Sebago to conduct inspections required by international treaty. Dr. Henrik Svensson, a Swedish physician serving as a neutral observer, interviewed prisoners privately to ensure compliance with Geneva Convention standards. His questions revealed the systematic nature of American prisoner feeding programs and the bureaucratic infrastructure supporting these operations. Dr. Svensson examined camp medical records, documenting the rapid health improvements among recently arrived prisoners. Weight gain averaged 4 pounds per week during the first month of American captivity. Vitamin deficiency symptoms that had been common among Afrika Korps veterans were resolving as prisoners consumed fresh fruits and vegetables absent from North African campaigns. Dental examinations showed improvements as calcium from dairy products began reversing damage caused by prolonged malnutrition. The doctor shared his findings with Lieutenant Colonel Mackenzie in a session that Brenner later learned about through camp rumor networks. American prisoner feeding exceeds Geneva Convention requirements by substantial margins, Dr. Svensson reportedly stated. Your prisoners receive better nutrition than I observe in many European civilian populations. This creates interesting questions about comparative resource availability and national priorities. Those questions occupied increasing space in Brenner's thoughts as days of abundance accumulated into weeks of unprecedented nutrition. His body was transforming in ways that felt almost uncomfortable after months of adapting to scarcity. His ribs became less prominent as muscle tissue rebuilt. His face filled out, losing the gaunt hollows that had made him appear a decade older than his 26 years. His energy levels increased as his metabolism adjusted to reliable caloric intake. But physical transformation brought psychological complications that proved more difficult to process than simple weight gain. Each excellent meal reinforced evidence that contradicted Nazi ideology about American weakness. Each casual waste of surplus food demonstrated abundance that seemed impossible given German propaganda about Jewish-controlled food hoarding and breadline desperation. Each interaction with well-fed American guards revealed a social system that appeared to function far better than the descriptions provided by German intelligence services. The contradictions culminated during a November snowstorm that blanketed Camp Sebago in 2 feet of white powder. Brenner had experienced winter in Russia before his transfer to Africa, so Maine's cold seemed manageable rather than severe. But what impressed him was the American response to weather conditions. The camp never lost electrical power despite the storm. Heat in the barracks continued without interruption. Food service maintained its schedule with no reduction in quality or quantity. The infrastructure simply worked, revealing systems designed to handle adverse conditions that would have crippled less robust facilities. That evening's meal featured what Americans called New England pot roast, beef that had been cooked slowly until tender, served with root vegetables and gravy thick enough to require bread for proper consumption. The portion sizes remained generous despite the storm's impact on supply deliveries, suggesting food stores so extensive that weather posed no threat to operational continuity. Holman, eating with his usual Prussian precision, made an observation that captured the growing sense of disorientation among ideologically committed prisoners. In Russia, winter halted all supply operations. Our divisions starved while waiting for roads to clear. Here, a snowstorm changes nothing. The Americans simply continue as if weather were irrelevant. This suggests logistical capacity that our planners never accounted for. The statement hung in the air between them, freighted with implications that neither man wanted to fully articulate. If American logistics could maintain abundant prisoner feeding through Maine winters, what did that suggest about their capacity to sustain combat operations? If they could afford to feed enemies better than Germany fed its own soldiers, what did that reveal about comparative industrial strength? And most troubling, if the propaganda had been wrong about American weakness, what else might German leadership have misrepresented? These questions would intensify as autumn turned to winter and prisoners experienced their first American Christmas, an event that would provide the most devastating challenge yet to Nazi ideology about American character and capability. December 25, 1944. Christmas morning arrived at Camp Sebago with temperatures hovering near zero and ice crystallizing on baroque windows in patterns that reminded Brenner of frost on Stuttgart cathedral glass. He woke expecting the subdued observance that had characterized military Christmases during wartime, perhaps a slightly larger bread ration or watery soup flavored with scraps of meat. Instead, American guards moved through the compound announcing a special holiday meal that would begin at noon, encouraging prisoners to dress warmly for outdoor activities that had been organized despite the bitter cold. The mess hall had been transformed overnight into something resembling a Bavarian Christmas market from Brenner's childhood memories. Evergreen branches decorated walls and doorways, their pine scent mixing with cooking aromas that seemed impossible for a prison camp. Electric lights, colored bulbs that wouldn't have been wasted on prisoner facilities in any European nation, twinkled along rafters in festive patterns. Tables were set with actual tablecloths, white linen that prisoners were instructed to treat with care. The meal began with clam chowder so rich it could have served as a main course, thick with cream and potatoes and seafood that represented wealth beyond anything Brenner's family had possessed before the war. This was followed by roasted turkey, whole birds carved at each table by American mess staff who served generous portions of white and dark meat. Stuffing made with cornbread and sausage. Mashed potatoes swimming in gravy. Cranberry sauce with a tart sweetness that contrasted perfectly with the rich poultry. Green beans cooked with bacon. Fresh rolls with butter. Dessert arrived on separate plates, 3 different types of pie arranged so each prisoner could sample multiple varieties. Pumpkin pie spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg. Apple pie with lattice crust. Mince pie containing fruits and spices that hadn't been available in Germany since peacetime. Whipped cream topped each slice, real dairy cream whipped to peaks that dissolved on the tongue like snow. Lindemann sat across from Brenner, tears streaming down his weathered face as he consumed his Christmas dinner. "My children are eating turnip soup today," he said quietly. "If they're fortunate, perhaps my wife found a potato to add. Here I sit eating turkey and pie while my family starves. What kind of world allows this?" The question had no comfortable answer. Hohmann, maintaining his Prussian composure despite visible emotion, offered an observation that cut deeper than any criticism of German leadership could have. "The Americans treat their enemies better than our government treats its own people. This is not propaganda or coincidence. This is systematic difference in how societies function and prioritize human welfare." After the meal, American chaplains conducted religious services in German, Protestant and Catholic ceremonies that acknowledged prisoners' spiritual needs with a respect that contradicted Nazi claims about American hostility toward German culture. Hymns were sung in Gothic German, carols that reminded men of Christmases spent with families they might never see again. The chaplains distributed small gifts, toiletries and writing supplies and chocolate bars, items that represented thoughtfulness beyond mere Geneva Convention compliance. Private Sullivan approached Brenner's table carrying a box of cigarettes, genuine American tobacco rather than the sawdust-filled substitutes that German soldiers had learned to tolerate. "Merry Christmas," he said in his broken German, placing the box on the table. "My grandmother always said you can't hate a man once you've broken bread with him." Maybe she was right. The psychological impact of Christmas 1944 reverberated through Camp Sebago for weeks afterward. Prisoners who had clung to Nazi ideology found their certainty eroding under accumulated evidence that America possessed resources and organizational capacity that German propaganda had either ignored or deliberately misrepresented. Letters home became increasingly frank about conditions, creating an information network that would eventually contribute to post-war understanding of American strength. Winter deepened across Maine with snowfalls that buried the camp under drifts requiring daily clearing operations. Yet through January and February, food service never faltered. Fresh milk arrived weekly from local dairy farms. Meat supplies remained abundant, beef and pork and chicken rotating through menus with regularity that suggested livestock populations immune to wartime scarcity. Coffee never ran short, real coffee that prisoners had learned to appreciate as tangible evidence of supply chains that functioned despite global conflict. Brenner's forestry work continued through winter months, cutting timber that would support American war production while prisoners received wages deposited into accounts they could access for small purchases at the camp store. The store itself represented another challenge to Nazi narratives, featuring goods that included candy bars, cigarettes, writing paper, and personal items that allowed prisoners to maintain dignity despite captivity. The prices were reasonable, suggesting the Americans weren't exploiting prisoner labor for profit but maintaining systems designed to preserve morale and health. By March 1945, as news of German military collapse began filtering through official channels and prisoner rumor networks, the psychological transformation was approaching completion. Brenner had gained 32 pounds since arrival, his body rebuilt through months of adequate nutrition. His worldview had undergone similar reconstruction as daily evidence contradicted everything Nazi education had taught him about American weakness, Jewish conspiracies, and German superiority. Holman organized informal discussion groups in the barracks, sessions where prisoners could openly question the ideology that had led them into a war Germany was clearly losing. The discussions revealed how thoroughly American abundance had undermined Nazi claims. If Jews controlled American wealth for evil purposes, why did Jewish American farmers produce food that fed German prisoners? If capitalism inevitably led to mass starvation, why did American workers enjoy living standards that exceeded German peacetime prosperity? If democracy weakened nations, why could democratic America sustain global war efforts while feeding enemies better than totalitarian Germany fed its own people? The questions accumulated into a comprehensive rejection of Nazi ideology, not through Allied propaganda but through lived experience that made lies impossible to maintain. Lindemann wrote his final wartime letter home in April 1945, a document that survived censorship because it criticized no one while documenting everything. The Americans have shown us what prosperity looks like when systems serve people rather than ideology. I have eaten better as a prisoner than I ever did as a free man in Germany. This truth haunts me. Germany's surrender in May 1945 brought mixed emotions to Camp Sebago. Relief that killing had ended mixed with shame about the regime prisoners had served and uncertainty about futures in a defeated nation. But American treatment didn't change with victory. Food remained abundant, work conditions stayed humane, and respect for prisoner dignity continued despite Germany's unconditional capitulation. The repatriation process began slowly, with prisoners deemed least ideologically committed returning first to help rebuild a shattered nation. Brenner remained at Camp Sebago through summer 1945, working in forests that had become familiar and eating meals that had become expected rather than miraculous. When his repatriation orders finally arrived in September, he faced a choice that would define his future. Lieutenant Colonel Mackenzie called him to the camp office, explaining options available under immigration laws designed to welcome prisoners who had demonstrated good conduct. You could return to Germany and face whatever conditions exist there, Mackenzie said. Or you could remain in America, bring your family over once paperwork processes, and build a life in a country that's demonstrated how it treats people, even former enemies. Brenner accepted American immigration sponsorship that evening, beginning legal processes that would eventually bring Maria and their children to Maine. He wasn't alone in this choice. 47 prisoners from Camp Sebago alone elected to remain in America, attracted by abundance they had witnessed and values they had experienced through treatment that exceeded any reasonable expectation for enemy captives. 23 years later, Karl Brenner stood in his Portland restaurant kitchen, preparing lobster rolls for lunch service that would feed local dock workers and tourists exploring Maine's rocky coast. His English had become fluent, his children were thoroughly American, and his restaurant had earned reputation for authentic Maine seafood prepared with German precision. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now served the same food that had challenged his ideology decades earlier. His son Thomas, born in America and ignorant of wartime hardships, asked about the old photograph displayed near the restaurant entrance. It showed young German prisoners standing outside Camp Sebago's mess hall, their faces showing the confusion of men encountering unexpected generosity. "That's me," Brenner explained, pointing to a gaunt figure in threadbare uniform. "The day I learned that strength isn't about conquest but about capacity to be generous even toward enemies." The transformation from prisoner to citizen, from enemy to American, represented democracy's ultimate victory. Not through battlefield triumph but through demonstrated values that converted adversaries into advocates. Brenner had come to Maine expecting punishment and discovered abundance. He had arrived as convinced Nazi and departed as living testimony to the power of systems that prioritized human dignity over ideology. His story, multiplied across thousands of former prisoners who chose American futures, proved that wars are won not just through military force but through demonstrating superior values in ways that make alternatives indefensible. The lobster rolls served at Camp Sebago had accomplished what battlefield victories alone could never achieve, creating permanent transformation through the simple act of feeding enemies as if they were human beings deserving respect rather than objects deserving punishment. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.